Good morning. Happy Thursday. Hope you all slept well. I woke up this morning and I felt like I'd never gone to sleep. Like I was super groggy. I don't know why. I went to bed at a good time, slept the whole night, and I woke up and was just like, is it morning already? How is that possible? I don't know. Crazy. Maybe it was the rain. The rain was really loud last night. If anybody else heard it or not, but wow. I woke up and I was like, was that my imagination? Did I hear rain last night? And I looked outside. Nope, everything's wet. I like it when it rains outside. Reminds me of Illinois. Because it rains at night in the Midwest. Alright, in our story today, we are on chapter 5, and it's called Hearts and Flowers. So we're now into like February time. Alright, so this first part is a letter from in the paper. After several weeks of hard winter, this end of the county is enjoying a January thaw. Mrs. Dowdle, a lifelong resident, observes that a January fog will kill a hog. Newsy notes from our communities, the County Piatt Call, or the Piatt County Call, which is apparently what the newspaper is called back there. We just finished up a Saturday breakfast when we heard a pecking of sharp heels out on the back porch. Grandma looked up. A shape showed in the steamy window of the back door. There came a fumbled knocking. "Better let her in," Grandma said. It was Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach, the banker's wife. Fools rush in, and she plunged past me into the kitchen. Grandma looked up and down at her. Mrs. Weidenbach's hat spilled black, artificial cherries off the brim. Her upper arm clamped a big pocketbook, and her coat featured a stand-up muskrat collar. Grandma considered the fur with a professional eye. Her gaze fell to Mrs. Weidenbach's hemline, though she had to appear around the table to see it. This may have been why Grandma saw that skirts were getting shorter this year. Mrs. Weidenbach showed a good deal of leg. "I won't keep you, Mrs. Dowdle," or "I won't keep you, Mrs. Dowdle," she sang, "as I see you are a busy woman." Having polished off a plate of scrapple and corn syrup, Grandma lolled. I will cut the cackle," Mrs. Weidenbach said, "and come straight to the point." Mrs. Weidenbach never came straight to the point. Her voice dropped. "Lord, word will have reached you about poor Mrs. Votzimer over at Bement." "Will it?" Grandma said. Mrs. Weidenbach clutched a chair back and leaned nearer. "The change," she said. "If she's thinking about making a change, who could blame her?" said Grandma. "Votzimer's no prize." Mrs. Weidenbach rested her eyes. "I mean, the change of life." She tried not to notice me nearby. "Hitting her hard, is it?" said Grandma, inquiring without interest. Mrs. Weidenbach clutched her own furry bosom and reeled. "The night sweats, the hot flashes, of course it's nothing to what I suffered, but—" Still, I couldn't go away. I was just off her elbow, hearing every forbidden word. And she was coming to the best part. Her voice fell. "And her womb dropped." "Do tell," Grandma said. "How far?" "She says it feels like it hit the floor," said Mrs. Weidenbach. She gave me a cold shoulder because I was sticking like Grandma to glue. "But as you know, I never gossip." Right, she never gossips. Grandma lurched in surprise. Coffee jumped out of her cup. "All I'm saying is Mrs. Votzimer is out of the running." A dreadful vision of Mrs. Votzimer trying to run with some of her insides bouncing on the floor almost sent me reeling. "And so we're up a gum stump about our Washington's birthday tea. It's our sacred tradition to serve cherry tarts to honor General Washington, and as the world knows, there's nobody to touch Mrs. Votzimer for her cherry tarts." As I remember the old saying, I don't think it really happened, but George Washington supposedly chopped down a cherry tree, and then his dad asks, "Son, did you chop down this cherry tree?" And George Washington's like, "I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I did." I don't think that really happened, but that's the story. So people eat cherries on President's Day or George Washington's birthday. No one ever chops wood on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Let's see. Mrs. Weidenbach's eyes snapped. "She's a plain woman, but there's a poetry in her pastry." "Who's throwing the party?" Grandma said. "Who?" Mrs. Weidenbach blinked. "Why, the DAR, of course. The Daughters of the American Revolution, of which I have the honor of being president." The DAR was a club of only the best ladies in town. They all traced their families back to the Revolutionary War, our side. That's a real club. As I expect you are aware, Mrs. Weidenbach said, warming up, my family descends from the Captain Crows, who was at Yorktown when Cornwallis was captured. My mother was a Crow, you know. Ah, Grandma muttered. That explains it. Frankly, Mrs. Dowdle, one of the sorrows of my marriage is that I don't have a daughter, and yes, a granddaughter who will step into my DAR shoes when the time comes. I couldn't help it. I looked down at her shoes. They were high-heeled and a size too small. Mrs. Weidenbach looked at me bleakly. After all, she had no granddaughter, and Grandma had me. Now she began to retreat because the January thaw hadn't thawed Grandma. I leave you with this thought, Mrs. Dowdle. The daughters of the American Revolution maintain a proud tradition of American aristocracy in even as humble a town as our own. Without cherry tarts, we are letting General Washington down. The town is still abuzz about your pumpkin and pecan pies, and I bow to nobody in my admiration for your flaky pastry. I charge you, Mrs. Dowdle, to play your part and come through for us. With that, she was gone. We listened to her pecking off the porch. Silence fell like a benediction. A benediction is a prayer, so everyone's quiet during a prayer. Grandma took her sweet time, then remarked, skimpy coat, wasn't it? She's courting pneumonia, going around naked to the knee. She wasn't wearing enough to pad a crutch. We sat at the table, listening to the icicles drip from the eaves. Finally, I said, Grandma, are we going to be making cherry tarts for her? Because we needed cornstarch, and we were out of lard. But she didn't hear me. There's different kinds of people in the world, she said. There's them who will invite you to join their bunch. Then there's them who will pay you for your work. Then there's Wilhelmina Weidenbach. And that seemed to be her final word on the subject. Winter resumes its grip as the younger set at the high school looks forward to an exchange of Valentine's Day cards. And the DAR is abuzz about its annual Washington's birthday tea. The high school will have its big red hearts, but where will the DAR get its cherry tarts? Newsy notes from our community, the Piatt County Call. So that was another letter that somebody sent into the newspaper. What's all this about a Valentine's Day exchange? Carleen said to Irene Stemple one February morning. Nobody told me about it. Newsy notes may have been optimistic. There was not a lot of girls, and there was a lot more girls than boys in school, and none of the boys seemed to be of a romantic nature. Irene paused and leaned over from her desk and pushed her big-eyed little face into mine. Somehow, she still looked scrawny and incomplete without her wings. It says in the paper there's going to be a Valentine exchange, she whispered. At the grade school, we always made our Valentines. We cut out hearts at our desks and put on lace. Elma Leeper ate the glue paste once. It was fun. Do you reckon we'll make them here? I doubt it, I whispered back. This is high school. Well, it beats what we're doing. Aunt Ina Ray stuck out her tongue at her history book. The classroom door opened. Principal Fluke stood there with a new boy. The day had been gray, but crisp winter sun broke through and seemed to find the newcomer. He was as tall as Mr. Fluke and lots better looking. His hair was red gold, according to the sun, and not cut at home. It was razor-trimmed over ears flat to his head. Forrest Pugh Jr.'s ears stood straight out like open car doors. Miss Butler, said Mr. Fluke, got you a new scholar. Looks like my prayers is answered, and I got me a scoring center for my basketball team. Mr. Fluke pointed at the top of the boy's head. Milton Girder flipped his pencil and slumped in his desk. At 5'9", he'd been the tallest boy in school. Till now. The new boy seemed to be 6 feet tall, easy. The back of Calreen Lovejoy's head vibrated. Name Royce McNabb, Mr. Fluke said. His pa's come in as a surveyor for county roads. Family's down from Coles County way. Mattoon. Let's call him a senior. If Royce McNabb minded hearing his personal business blurted out in front of all strangers, he didn't let on. But then he was from Mattoon, which was citified for these parts, and sure enough he was wearing corduroy pants, not overalls, an argyle pattern sweater strained across his broad shoulders. Ahead of me, Carlene gripped herself. "Be still, my heart," she murmured loudly. Then she leaned across to Irene's temple and said, "Hands off, he's mine." She's nice. "Move over, Milton," Mrs. Butler said, "and make Royce welcome." Royce went through the day with the same smile for everybody. He'd probably been in a lot of schools and knew how to handle himself. When I got home, I told Grandma we had a new boy at school. She waved him away. "The town's filling up with people. You wouldn't know Adams off Ox. From Adams off Ox." I don't know what that means. "You wouldn't know from Adams off Ox." Maybe they mean they're just random people you don't know. "Not like the old days when you knew your neighbors." Oh, that makes sense. "The winters were colder back then, too. Birthday, Grandma." "People starved to death because their jaws froze shut," she said. "You getting interested in boys?" "Who? Me?" I said. At that, we heard Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach fumbling at the back door. When I let her in, there was icy crystal in her muskrat. She elbowed past me, her eyes teary with cold and emotion. Grandma had been over by the Hoosier cabinet. Now she was sitting down, seemingly at her ease. "Mrs. Dowdle, we cannot pussyfoot any more over these cherry tarts." Mrs. Weidenbach grappled with her giant purse and came up with the Piatt County Call newspaper. "I need a commitment. My land. It's in the paper now. It has inspired 2 lines of bad verse." Grandma didn't read the paper, so Mrs. Weidenbach shook it open and read, "The high school will have its big red hearts, but where will the DAR get its cherry tarts?" Doesn't that turn your stomach?" she demanded. "I don't call it reporting, and I don't call it poetry. It's snooping, and possibly by a foreign power. The dignity of the DAR on the line." Grandma picked a loose thread from her apron front. "Mrs. Dowdle, I need your answer before we get any more publicity of this sort." "Oh, well," Grandma turned over a large hand on the oilcloth. "If it's my patriotic duty, I'll bake up a mess of tarts." The wind went out of Mrs. Weidenbach. She'd been geared up for a larger struggle, more on the lines of the Battle of Bunker Hill. "You will? Well, that's real reasonable of you." "All in good cause," Grandma said. Mrs. Weidenbach turned to go, but didn't make it to the door. "On my terms," Grandma said. Mrs. Weidenbach turned back slowly. "We'll have your DART right here at my house." "But it'll be handier for me," Grandma said. "I don't get out much anymore." That was a whopper, but Mrs. Weidenbach's head was whirling. "Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain. There's more than a social occasion. This is a meeting of our DAR chapter, strictly limited to our members. It's always at my house." "I'll fire up the stove in my front room," Grandma said. "It'll be warm as toast in there. Or you can serve store-bought cupcakes at your place," Mrs. Weidenbach crumbled. So, Mrs. Weidenbach is so rude. She's asking Grandma to bake tarts for a group that she's not part of. And she was not going to invite her even to the gathering. She's going to say, "Oh, I'll have the tarts in my house," and you're not even invited. What a terrible woman. Oh my goodness, Mrs. Weidenbach. If I were Grandma, I don't know what I would have done. I would have been mad. I was at school early on Valentine's Day, but Miss Butler was there before me. Since the newspaper had announced a Valentine exchange, she thought she'd better fill in with a Valentine of her own on everybody's desk. Hers were the flimsy kind that came in a sheet you punched out, so that was one Valentine apiece. When people straggled in, they found their Valentines. "Honestly," Carlene said, rolling her eyes when she saw her Valentine from Miss Butler. She stuffed it into her desk. Then here came Ina Ray. On her desk, beside mine, Miss Butler's Valentine was there, and 3 more. Ina Ray clasped both hands over her mouth. She squeaked, and people turned to look. She was all eyes. And she really was the thinnest girl in the world. She was skinnier than a toothpick with termites. She looked around to see how many Valentines everybody else got. 1 apiece. Ina Ray crept into her desk. Her hands dithered over the paper pile. Dithered. It's like, dithered over the paper pile. She, too, made short work of Miss Butler's Valentine. Then she took up the next one. It was homemade to a fault. It looked like it had been whittled, not cut out. The message read, "I send this sentiment in haste, but at least I didn't eat the paste. A secret admirer." Ina Ray stared, then leaned over far. She was almost in my lap. "I think this one's from Elmo Leaper," she confided at the top of her voice. "Can you believe it?" And really, I couldn't. Ina Ray sat straighter in her desk now. Maturely, she took up the next valentine. It was somewhat better made, with odd little tufts of cotton batting stuck on it. It read, "Simple shepherds are we, and too sheepish to say, have a happy Valentine's Day. Unsigned." Ina Ray gasped. Then she was all over me again. "The Johnson brothers! Can it be?" As luck would have it, Elmo Leaper and the Johnson brothers were across the hall with Mr. Herkimer. But word had it that they'd sent Ina Ray valentines, swept our room like grass fire. It means it went fast, because grass fire goes fast, especially when it's dry. It's another simile. It didn't take long. There were only about 12 of us. Calreen Lovejoy looked back in annoyance. Now Irene came to the last valentine, and I could hardly wait. It really was lovely. A white satin heart, padded like a little pillow and surrounded by a double row of paper lace neatly pasted on. Hours to make. Irene cradled it in trembling hands to read. "To the sweetest little girl in this room or any room, from R. McN." "Oh, Mary Alice!" Ina Ray bounced in her desk. She seemed overcome with self-confidence. Word radiated out that Royce McNabb had sent Ina Ray Gage a valentine. Royce was there too, but seemed not to notice. He always brought an Edgar Rice Burroughs book or a Rider Hager book to read before school took up. Word reached Calreen, though. Ina Ray and I watched her vibrate. Then she blew. Out of her desk she switched and stalked back to us. "Let me see that thing!" She snatched the satin heart out of Irena's hand, ripping lace. Calreen read the message for herself. Every word burned into her brain. She looked back at Royce McNabb. He sat there with his chin in his hand, reading. Royce was out of reach. Calreen slammed the valentine on Ina Ray's desk, got down in her face, and howled, "What have you been up to, you trashy little squirt?" A single tear replaced the gleam in Irene's eyes. Miss Butler came out of her desk. "Calreen, leave the room!" So Calreen had to. Royce looked up as she slumped past him. The back of her neck was valentine red and hot-looking. The door closed behind her. It was 8 o'clock on the nose, so we all got up to give the Pledge of Allegiance. Ina Ray lifted her desktop to sneak little peeks at her valentines all morning, cooing loudly. Down in the basement at noon, when we were eating out of our dinner buckets, all the girls wanted to sit near her, even Irene Stemple. Royce shot baskets by himself down at the other end. He never really was a team player, though he had a nice hook shot. Not that I knew anything about basketball. Calreen wasn't there. A smart mouth sent you home in those days. Afterwards, out at the pump, Irene sidled up to me. "That was fun! Did you see Calreen's face? Can I keep the valentines, can't I? You sure dreamed up some swell messages, Mary Alice, especially R. McN. They must have took you absolutely days to make." "All in good cause," I said. Irene had played her role well, too. I liked the tear in her eye. Then I went to scrubbing under the pump. My hands had been gummy for days. I thought I'd never get all the paste off them. Oh, it's 7:40. So they all just cooked up. They just cooked up that whole Valentine's thing. None of the boys actually sent them any Valentines. Funny. February turned out to be my busiest month. I was no sooner through making Valentines than Grandma had me rolling out pastry for tarts, and always from the center out. We spent the weekend before the DART with towels around our middles and our hair tucked up. The kitchen was a white fog of flour. Then on Washington's birthday, the tea was set for 4 o'clock, so I hightailed it home from school. In the kitchen, the tarts were laid out on cookie sheets, little works of art, each and every one. Grandma was nowhere to be seen. Then, there she stood in the doorway to the front room. "Grandma?" She seemed to ponder the distance off my right ear. She was posing? Her snow-white hair waved down from a neat center parting and drew back in a bun so tight her no hair escaped. Pearls hung in her ears. There were traces of cotty powder in the lapses below her chins. I'd never seen her in this dress, and it must have been from the Lane Bryant catalog. It was maroon wool crepe, with many taken tucks across the prow. My gaze fell to her waist, where a self belt was holding its own. And, could it be? A lacy handkerchief was tucked up in a cuff below one large wrist. New shoes peered out from below her skirts. Fine, big, black patent leather boats. I mean, she's got big feet. The tears started in my eyes. I wanted to hold her in that moment forever, framed in that door. "Grandma," I said, "you're beautiful." She waved me away. But she was. A flouncy white party apron she'd made for me hung over the kitchen chair. She tied it around my waist and pointed to a tray of punch cups. No tear appeared to be brewing, but she seemed to want me out of the kitchen while she made the punch. I carried the tray into the front room. It was hot as August in there. Ooh, another simile. I nearly pitched all the glassware on the rug in surprise. A lady had already arrived and occupied the best chair, and she was no member of the DAR. It was Mrs. Effie Wilcox. Miss Wilcox in a hat and apron, but a nice visiting apron. Her eyes and her teeth seemed to be all over the room. She's funny looking. Grandma had set up a table with a white cloth. I put the tray down. Turning, I had the next shock. In the rocker by the stove was another lady, wrapped in shawls and old as the hills. She wasn't DAR either. She looked like she might me smoke a corncob pipe. I couldn't tell if Miss Wilcox noticed me. Excuse me. You could never tell where she was looking. But the ancient lady was sound asleep because somebody had parked her too close to the glowing stove. She was alive, though. You could have heard her breathing all over the house. Back in the kitchen, I said, "Grandma, who's the old party on the other side of the stove?" She turned from a large bowl of brilliant red punch. "Oh, that's Aunt May Griswold. The Cowgills brought her to town in their dairy wagon. She don't get out much anymore." "Grandma, how old is she?" "Oh, I don't know," Grandma said. "You'd have to cut off her head and count the rings in her neck." Oh, that's what you do to a tree. But then a rapping at the front door echoed through the house. "That'll be the DAR." Grandma was cool as a cucumber, as if they often called. When I opened the door, Mrs. Weidenbach swept in, followed by Mrs. Broshear, the undertaker's wife, Mrs. Forrest Pugh, then Mrs. Lutz, the preacher's wife, and at last Mrs. Earl T. Askew. All of them were hatted and corseted, veiled and gloved. I'm surprised. They didn't usually wear corsets in the late 30s by then. I thought they were gone. They sensed trouble at once. "Oh, tell me I'm wrong," one of them blurted. "Is that Effie Wilcox?" "Howdy," Miss Wilcox said, looking them all over at once. They spotted Aunt May Griswold. Her jaw had dropped. She had 2 teeth, and she whistled as she snored. They stared. "She'll be next," said the undertaker's wife. An undertaker is someone who takes the dead bodies and prepares them for burial. So she'd know, I guess. They had looked up to see Grandma, tall in the room, her big fingers laced before her. She looked as good as any of them. Better, if you ask me. They knew at once she was in charge of the party. "You can throw your coats back," she said in a welcome, "or this girl here'll take 'em." Mrs. Earl T. Askew was in Persian lamb and wouldn't give me her coat. She longed to be free. They milled in the room, running into each other. 7:45. Nobody wanted to sit next to Mrs. Wilcox. They noticed the pink silk pillow with the gold fringe Grandma had put out to dress up the sofa. It bore the message, "Souvenir of Starved Rock, Illinois." I brought out kitchen chairs. Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach called the meeting to order, though she was rattled. "We will dispense with our usual order of business," she began, "as we are not alone. But I will call upon Mrs. Lutz to give the invocation, or the prayer." "How about a swig of fruit punch to wet your whistles first?" boomed Grandma. I went to the kitchen for the punch bowl and handed out brimming cups. Mrs. Lutz rose for the invocation, which went on and on. I had time to bring out all the refreshments. When Mrs. Lutz finally ran down, Aunt May Griswold came to sudden life. "Amen, sister!" she called out, walking in a crowd. She may have thought she was in church. Who are you, honey?" Aunt May inquired of Mrs. Weidenbach, who sat too near her. "We are the DAR," Mrs. Weidenbach said sniffly. "We trace our families back to the American Revolution." "Speak right up to her," Grandma roared from the kitchen door. "She's deaf as a post." "Speak right up to me," Aunt May said. "I'm deaf as a post." But I'm talking about you, honey. Who was you? I was Wilhelmina Roach before my marriage, Mrs. Weidenbach spoke stiffly, but she was willing to give her history. I trace back through my mother to the Crows of Culpeper County, Virginia, and Captain... Oh, honey, you don't. Uh-oh. Aunt May was wide awake now, bright as a button. The room hung suspended. They hardly noticed when I refilled their punch cups. You be about what, 56? Aunt May squinted. Mrs. Weidenbach paled and took a quick swallow of punch. Well, I remember when the Roaches took you, Aunt May recalled. It was about 1883, wasn't it? You was a burdock. Oh, gosh. All the air went out of the room. The county took you and your sister away from the burdocks, as they was all mostly in the pokey at the time. You and your sister was put in separate foster homes. Nobody wanted both you. I remember it like it was yesterday. Aunt May sat back and rocked. Oh, yes, you was a burdock. That green-eyed, blue-eyed trait came into the family later from a lightning rod salesman. The silence was deathly. Mrs. Effie Wilcox rose from her chair. Her hat hung from a single pin. And the Schultzes took me! She cried out. They never wanted to tell me who I was. They said it would mark me for life. The DAR ladies fell back. Mrs. Wilcox made a beeline across the room. You's my long-lost sister! She flung out her arms to Mrs. Weidenbach, who flinched. Punch went everywhere, and horror and defeat were written in her face. The afternoon descended from there. Mrs. Askew fled, perhaps to spread the news. The rest circled Mrs. Weidenbach, excuse me, to support her and wall out Mrs. Effie Wilcox. The front room was as hot as the Amazon jungle, and several needed a third cup of punch. They were in tears now, and Mrs. Weidenbach was hysterical. They bore her away, out the front door in a gaggle, their hats over their ears and their veils trailing. None of them walked in a straight line, and Mrs. Wilcox wove after them in pursuit. And come to think of it, she and Mrs. Weidenbach had the same coloring, pasty face, different teeth, but Mrs. Weidenbach's may not have been her own. Mrs. Wilcox paused at the front door, where Grandma was seeing her guest off. I guess Wilhelmina broke down with joy at finding me at last, Mrs. Wilcox said. Very likely, said Grandma, closing the front door behind them all. She turned to savor the quiet of the room. Aunt May Griswold had dropped off again. Her jaw gaped. She snored a little, whistling, sleepy time tune. Grandma spoke low. What in the Sam Hill are we going to do with all them tarts? But we got through them in time. There wasn't a drop of punch left. It had been 1 part strawberry juice and 2 parts Kentucky straight bourbon. I found the empty bottle of Old Turkey later. And here's another newsy note from the newspaper. With a short break of tradition, Mrs. Dowdle was hostess for this year's DAR Washington's birthday tea. Honored guests were Miss Effie Wilcox and Aunt May Griswold. A sudden cold snap has cost the life of a heifer on the Bowman farm and killed a hog. Newsy notes from our communities. The Piatt County Call. It used to be in newspapers a long time ago. They just random information about social stuff in town would be in the paper, probably because there was no other way of communicating, who made social calls and who went driving in their car the other day, and just really strange things that we wouldn't think would be that important now, but they would post it in the paper. Like I said, no Facebook back then, no cell phones, no phones, so I don't know. I wrote my last newsy notes and copied it over neatly. As Miss Butler always said, the only real writing is rewriting. Then I dropped it off, as usual, down at the post office on my way to school. So Mary Alice was the person who was writing the newsy notes. Interesting. And Mrs. Wilcox apparently is related to Mrs. Weidenbach, the banker's wife. All right. Well, I hope you all have a fantastic morning. It's supposed to be in the mid-60s today. And I hope that you all get a lot of work done, like reading and math. And I hope that you watch the math videos because they are very helpful, I think, for you to be getting your math done. And I hope everyone gets in their PowerPoints because those are due. And if you have any questions, please give me a holler, because I am always available to be answering questions if you have any. Bye, all.